Hello everyone, this is Mark Semedini from Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and I'm here with Dave Loper and we from ClearCenter, and we are here to do another screencast. This time we're going to cover configuring RAID in a manual install. Specifically, what we'll cover is the difference between software and hardware RAID. We'll cover the level of RAID supported in software RAID through ClearOS. We'll cover LVM and why it matters, and then we'll end off with the partitions needed. So Dave, help us out.
All right, thanks, Mark. So in ClearOS, you have the option for both software and hardware RAID, and with hardware RAID on HPE ProLiant servers, we're going to have broad support for pretty much all of the RAID controllers, except for the HP BSA controller, which is the kind of the BIOS level. It's software in BIOS.
Yeah, our free RAID that's with like practically every server.
Sure. So with that, we have a different type of software RAID support that's in the operating system, and you'll want to use that with ClearOS. But if you have a hardware RAID controller, then go ahead and provision that in the BIOS or in the tools for your HPE server. And that will get presented to ClearOS as a drive. So if you set up some different drives and you present 3 different RAIDs, you're going to see 3 different drives. So some of the advantages and disadvantages, this is a long debate, and a lot of people have differing opinions about whether software RAID is better or hardware RAID is better. And from my point of view, the answer is it depends. What is it you're trying to have as an outcome? If you are trying to have flexibility as an outcome, then software RAID can give you a little bit more flexibility because you can put multiple RAID types on the same drive. So if I have 4 different drives, for example, I could set up one partition that's RAID 0, another partition that's RAID 1, another partition that's RAID 5, and another partition that's RAID 6, and 10, and so on. So I can do all of that with the same 4 drives. With hardware RAID, you're going to end up doing, you have to take those. Yeah, you take those 4 disks and you decide what you want for the whole thing. Now that may seem like a stringent limitation, but there's a good reason for it in hardware RAID, and that is because the way that hardware RAID works is it's working at a very low level mechanism, and it's treating the drive as a block device at a very low level, and it needs to be able to replicate partitions and other types of things, whereas software RAID is embedded underneath something. So again, it's an advantage or a disadvantage, and you need to decide which one is the best for your client. One advantage of software RAID is that you can actually take those disks and move them to other systems, whereas with some traditional RAID controllers, some non-HPE RAID controllers, if you take those and you take it from one type, say for instance you got a HPE RAID controller, and then you take it to another different provider's RAID controller, it might not work. You may get different results. But with software RAID, you're just treating it like a bunch of disks. And because you're using an open standard like the multi-disk RAID manager, the MD RAID, that becomes portable between different stacks. So again, it's all about what it is you're trying to accomplish and what the scenario is. We're going to cover the software RAID in this video because it's part of the ClearOS installation, and this series is on the installation of ClearOS.
And I think that the key thing for everybody to realize is that it's part of ClearOS, which when you pay for ClearOS, it's included. Whereas with the hardware controller, you have to buy it. With the dynamic smart array controller, that's something that's free from HPE, but because it's not supported here, it's not an option for people. So we really are providing them an option, and not only for free, and it's not only a decent option, it's a really good option as opposed to the dynamic smart array from HPE.
Right. So with the dynamic smart array, again, you can't necessarily take those drives and transport them to a different system. So it's like the advantages that you have from software RAID and the advantages that you have from hardware RAID are not as well represented in the DSA. So The software RAID is a really good mechanism, and there's a lot of admins that even if they have a hardware RAID option, they're going to choose that because that's the way that they roll. And then there's others that will do hardware RAID and only hardware RAID because that's what they trust and that's what they know and that's what they use. So
and they probably like it for the speed and being able to pull out a disk at
right.
any time.
They like it for the fact that they can get a battery backup, and if there's write operations that happen after a power loss, they can still recover there. So just because we're only touching lightly on the hardware RAID and its general support in ClearOS doesn't mean that we don't recommend it as for ClearOS, because we do. We do in the situations where it makes sense. But we're going to cover some of the software RAID options that are available here. So when you get to your install, again, you're going to want to address anything that has an exclamation point in it. And your disks are typically going to have this exclamation point. So here we're going to select the installation destination, and you can see that in this VM I have 4 different drives. They're all 8 gig in size. And with this I can set up various different RAID combinations. So we have support for RAID 0, 1, 4, 5, 6, and 10. Typically 4 isn't used very much. I don't know very many admins that have been able to say, okay, well, I really want to do that. But this is open source, and this is an open standard, so we have support for it anyway. Commonly, RAID 0 is used for things where you don't care about the redundancy of the disk at all. In fact, RAID 0 has a greater chance of failing than if you were to use those disks singularly, because if you have one disk fail, they're all gone. Whereas if you had 4 single disks and one of them fails, then you only lost a quarter of your data. So where does RAID 0 make sense? It makes sense if you're doing something that doesn't really require any long-term storage or backup consideration. Caching types of scenarios are good for RAID 0 because maybe you need something to be really fast. RAID 0 is very fast because you're able to write and read from multiple disks at a time. RAID 1 is very, very common for like your boot partition, because RAID 1 allows you to mirror your data between 2 drives. And with ClearOS, you can actually RAID 1 across multiple drives more than just 2. You can have RAID 1 across 3 or even 4 drives. And that's really an advantage, especially if you wanted to say, okay, I'm going to make my operating system partition, and I'm going to put it on just a small spot of, maybe you got a 10 terabyte drive, and you say, okay, 20 gig of that I'm going to set up for the operating system, and I'm going to just have the core of the operating system on that 20 gig and have it mirrored across all of the drives. That way, any number of your drives could fail. As long as you had one surviving drive, you can still boot the machine and troubleshoot it. So that is a very common scenario that you see with RAID 1, and that is supported in software RAID. Now, RAID 1 is also bootable, and so it also is commonly used for the operating system partitions and boot partitions because of that bootable nature. RAID 5 is great for storing the most amount of data with an option to recover if there's an issue. RAID 6 gives you 2 drives that could fail before you lose your data set. And RAID 10 does a combination of RAID 1 and RAID 0. So you can think of it as 10, or sometimes it's written as 1 plus 0. But what that does is that creates some drives that are in a mirror, and then takes another set of drives and then takes those different mirrors and then puts them together as a volume set. So you can have any one drive fail, and you still have a lot of speed, and then just replace that drive, and then it'll rebuild that individual mirror, and then it's part of that greater volume set. LVM is also a component here. Let's get into our RAID configuration so that you can see. I'm going to select all these disks here, and I'm going to choose I will configure partitioning. Now what this will do is it will give you a menu here, and you can see I have a previous install of ClearOS. I'm going to trash it and start with a blank slate. Now, one thing you can do with this RAID manager is that this partitioning manager is you can base a set of disks automatically. This is a good button to check even if you just want to see what is minimally needed, right? So on a UEFI system, you're also going to need an EFI partition. That's a FAT32 partition, and it's important to see, you know, that's there, and we'll automatically detect whether it's legacy or non-legacy, and delete. And you can delete this and start over again if you wanted to. Again, that's just you just hit the minus button here and go over the different partitions. And here I'm going to say I want to create them as a RAID. So here I have RAID 1. Again, for the boot, you're going to want to do that as a RAID 1 instead of like a 5 or a 6 because it's harder for the grub to read those, and you're not going to have success unless you do like a RAID 1. So boot can be small. Here we have 1 GB in size. We have it set for RAID. It's selecting SD. All right, I'm going to hit update here. And there we have it. Okay, so the root partition, again, this can be set up in RAID as well. We recommend that you do use like a RAID 1. You don't want to have your root partition on RAID 5, for example. It's not going to be as fast and dynamic. RAID 5 and RAID 6, they're probably not good options for your root partition. RAID 10 is definitely a possibility, and I would never use RAID 0 because you're just not going to have the type of resiliency. Now, what's interesting about doing RAID on these other partitions is that we can actually incorporate LVM. And LVM deserves a special attention here because LVM can exist underneath of the system, and it has its own ability to do RAID. So rather than selecting like a RAID partition, we can actually just have the partition be LVM, and we can modify it so that we set up different RAID levels here within the LVM. And I can go and I can say, okay, I want this to be RAID 1. I want to save this. I want to change the size. Maybe you want to have a little bit of different size for your additional partitions. Swap can also be put under LVM, and it can be put under RAID. Now, this is another partition that really does well under RAID 1. It's really important that your swap partition not be RAID 0, because if you have a drive that fails and you lose your swap, you can corrupt memory if you have memory inside swap. So here we're going to choose RAID 1. I mean, it'll let you do RAID 0, but again, you shouldn't. Even though it says performance, you shouldn't. So here we're going to change the size down a little bit. 4.8, I usually set it to. I'm going to update settings. It's going to find the closest it can do to that. And again, we're in the same volume group. And then we're good to go. I'm going to add one more partition here. I'm going to call this store data 0. And I'm going to leave this capacity blank and hit mount point. Now what that will do is it will give me the balance of my hard disks as a partition. And here you can choose to either keep it in the same volume group or put it in a different volume group. And I'm going to choose RAID 5 because I want to maximize how much data I have there. And then later I can bind mount data points into that data partition. So that makes it really useful because you can set up a large partition where you're keeping kind of your user data and keep your operating system kind of small, and then anything that's you have an application in the marketplace like FlexShares or Plex Media Server or a SQL database or a mail server that's going to expand in space, you can actually bind mount it into this extra data partition. There's two advantages to that. Number one is you can have it be under a different RAID option than the regular system. And the second thing is you can have it so that it is something that you skip when you do a reinstall. So your data can actually preserve through a reinstall of the system using that sort of mechanism. So here we're ready to do our install. If we have any problems and we hit done, then it will give us some warnings about that, and we can change stuff. Here's all the different steps that it's going to do to create our desired RAID. And if everything is good, it will give you this screen without an exclamation point under the installation destination.
That's awesome. Well, thanks, Dave. This is another screencast covering ClearOS and configuring RAID in a manual install. We covered the differences between software and hardware RAID. We covered the RAID levels supported, LVM and why it matters, and the partitions that are needed. Thanks, Dave.
Right, thanks, Mark.